As the 19th century entered its second half, technology and war were again working to remake the map of Europe. We shall first turn attention to the Ottoman Empire to the east and how this once great empire went from being a leader in culture, politics, and war to a declining, decrepit power. Then we shall focus on a new type of war that took place in and around the Black Sea region. And finally, we shall examine the rise of Prussian power and the German Empire under their great leader Otto von Bismarck and his great domestic program called Kulturkampf. When one speaks of the sick man of Europe in the mid to late 19th century, one speaks of the Ottoman Empire. This was the Sultanate that had occupied and or dominated Turkey and the Balkans, the Middle East and North Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt and Mesopotamia since its rise at the beginning of the 14th century. At one time, the Ottomans were leaders in technology. Their armies were feared. But the Ottomans by the 18th century had suffered a decline. It resulted in a series of defeats. And military reforms, such as artillery and so forth, were hampered by the religious leaders of the empire. Now, while you all will read more about this in your book, What Went Wrong, suffice it to say that the empire of the Ottomans was, by the middle of the 1800s, beset by fractious administrations and constant rebellions. They undertook a period of reform in the mid-1830s called the Tanzimat. This liberalized and secularized the empire. For instance, homosexuality was no longer prosecuted as a crime. This is in no small part due to the influences of both the French Revolution and Napoleon after that. The Ottomans possessed an antiquated army and navy that made it vulnerable to attacks, especially from Russia, who sought to increase its influence over Constantinople because that was the primary warm water access that Russia had to the sea. Again, I have to point out to you all that ports like St. Petersburg, Archangel, and Murmansk are frozen throughout half of the year. The Black Sea and the Straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles gives Russia access to the Mediterranean and a warm water port. Now, Britain and France supported the Ottomans in their quarrels and squabbles with Russia, and they opposed the Russian attempts to gain territory at the expense of the Ottomans. In the ensuing negotiations, Tsar Nicholas I and French Emperor Napoleon III would not back down from their demands. This map shows the extent of the Ottoman Empire in 1683, roughly around the same time as the reign of Louis XIV. The Crimean War was from 1853 to 1856, and it came about because the Western powers of Britain and France attempted to check the absolutism of the Russians, and because of Napoleon III's desire to assert the grandeur of France. Karl Marx wrote an article in the New York Tribune that the Crimean War was a conflict between the democratic ideals of the West that started with the great movement of 1789, the French Revolution, against Russia and absolutism. Marx described the Ottoman Empire as a buffer against a pattern of expansionism by the Tsar. Now, Marx's opinions are his own, of course, but they are, in part, truthful. The immediate causes of the war lay in the French desire to assert authority in the Holy Land over all Christians, and this pissed off the Russians, who are Orthodox. Britain then prodded the Ottomans to defy Russian attempts to claim protectorship over the Orthodox Christians in the Holy Land and sent its fleet to assist the Turks. Napoleon immediately sent his own fleet as well. Despite diplomatic attempts to head off a conflict, the Russian fleet destroyed an Ottoman fleet at the port city of Sinope, which is on the northern coast of Turkey on the Black Sea. This led France and Great Britain to declare war on Russia in 1854. Now, while the war took place around the Black Sea region, the siege of the town of Sevastopol went on for 11 months and featured hand-to-hand fighting and miserable conditions. The city of Sevastopol is located on the Crimean Peninsula, that is the great diamond-shaped peninsula that sticks into the Black Sea and has been on the news recently because Russia has essentially annexed that from the Ukraine. Let's get back to this war here. In the Crimean War, both sides were plagued by incompetent generals. Many of the British officers had purchased their commissions. They hadn't actually earned them. The armies were very poorly prepared. They had insufficient supplies. They had lack of adequate medical care. In addition, the French and the British and the Ottomans were not natural allies, and they did not coordinate their campaigns very well. Remember that the British and the French had fought each other in the days of Napoleon just 40 years earlier. So there was little love between the soldiers of the two nations. For instance, one of the British commanders, Lord Raglan, had lost an arm at Waterloo, and he referred to the French as the enemy in this battle. Now, there were some interesting figures and units in the war. General John Burgoyne was a British commander. He was the illegitimate son of the British gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, who lost the Battle of Saratoga to the Americans during the Revolutionary War. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders had fought at the Battle of New Orleans, and their battle tactic of having just 2 lines to repel a Russian cavalry charge led to the term Thin Red Line. The man you see in the photo was Lieutenant General James Thomas Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan, known as simply Lord Cardigan. He commanded the forces at the Battle of Balaclava, which is just at the bottom tip of the Crimean Peninsula. He was incredibly incompetent, but he got by because he was absolutely brave under fire, and he took excellent care of his men when not in battle. On the other side, there was a young Russian artillery officer named Leo Tolstoy. He was one of those manning the breastworks at Sevastopol and wrote numerous short sketches about life in the war. A Frenchman by the name of Alexis Benoit Soyer was a French chef who became the most celebrated cook in all of Victorian England. He tried to alleviate the suffering of the Irish during the Great Hunger. He worked to improve the food provided to British soldiers in the Crimean War. He also created a field stove that the British Army used until 1982. The Battle of Balaclava is probably the most significant battle of the entire Crimean conflict. Commanded on the British side by Lord Cardigan, the Battle of Balaclava featured the famous Charge of the Light Brigade, which many thought was a very foolhardy venture, but it actually did achieve some goals. The main problem with the Charge of the Light Brigade is they went charging into the wrong valley. The Crimean War was a new type of war, and one side at least was able to adapt a little bit. The Russians were not, and when it became clear that the Russians were the most incompetent of the warring powers and were losing the war, Tsar Alexander II signed the Peace of Paris in 1856. Later, he feared that the British might move against Russia in the Bering Sea and take advantage of Russian weakness. And so the Tsar eventually sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 as a result of this. In the aftermath, Russia lost its naval bases in the Black Sea. It was not allowed to have a navy in the Black Sea anymore. Moldavia and Wallachia merged to form the country of Romania, which was carved out of Austrian lands. Austria, which had sat out this war, actually lost territory as a result of this. More than 750,000 soldiers died in this war, most of them from disease and malnutrition. The war was a study in abject lack of preparation. However, the reputation of the British cavalry grew after the charge of the Light Brigade, and part of this was because of Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. The war ushered in new technologies and innovations. This is the first war to use the telegraph. The British actually laid a cable from London all the way to the Crimea so that you could have dispatches from the battlefield. It used railroads effectively. There were war correspondents for the first time using that telegraph to send dispatches from the battlefield. Battlefield photography was used. Thanks to these new technologies, you had war correspondents like William Howard Russell. He was a Times of London reporter who won legions of readers and the hatred of many generals for his description of military blunders and the appalling conditions of the Army's camps and hospitals. He was your first embedded reporter. Russell's reports helped convince the British government to allow nurses such as Florence Nightingale to join in the war effort. And his coverage of the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava inspired Alfred Lord Tennyson to put his poem to paper. Florence Nightingale, who I've already mentioned, she's the lady with the lamp. She revolutionized the nursing profession. She effectively made nursing a profession. She also helped create the understanding for sanitary conditions in the field hospitals and hospital anesthetics, plaster casts, amputation methods. In this war, the British government would begin issuing its highest military decoration, called the Victoria Cross. Here you see a map of the region in which the Crimean War was fought. The red dots on the middle of the map show Sevastopol and Balaclava. Bottom left, you see the city of Constantinople, one of my favorite cities to mark on any map, and also on the north coast of Turkey on the Black Sea is the port of Sinope, which is where the Russians defeated the Ottoman fleet. You will also notice to the left of the map, on the western side, Wallachia and Moldavia. These are the two regions that come together to form Romania. This is a map featuring the charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though soldier knew, someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the saber stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honor the charge they made, honored the Light Brigade, noble 600. This photograph is called The Valley of the Shadow of Death. It's photographed by Roger Fenton. The image shows a ravine covered with cannonballs, an indication of the horror of the Crimean War. This photo, however, was staged by Fenton. he had moved the cannonballs into the road. This was not an uncommon thing to do during the early days of photography. You staged photographs. Here you see the Soyer stove. This is the Army field stove that was used in the field by British and other armies. Here you see Florence Nightingale, who, let's just say that the newspapers did exaggerate her work just a little bit, but it cannot be denied that she revolutionized the nursing profession. She wrote numerous manuals on nursing and wrote it in very basic style of English so that anybody could understand it. Florence Nightingale was not alone. She was not the only nurse that was out there. You also had a Jamaican-born woman named Mary Jane Seacole. She was of Scottish and Creole descent. She traveled to the Crimea and became a nurse. She also sold supplies, food, and medicine. She treated the wounded on the front lines. She was called the Creole with the tea mug because she said nothing was so bad that it could not be cured with a good cup of tea. As a result of the war, Russia became isolated. And Russia became isolated because Austria had been convinced by the French to sit the war out and not come to the aid of their old ally, Russia. Napoleon had achieved his goal of prying Austria away from Russia, and he had ended their alliance. And this would wind up hurting Austria the most because they would lose Romania. It also brought an end to the concert of Europe. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, even though the Ottomans had essentially been on the winning side, reform and national unification movements began to erupt throughout the Ottoman Empire. There were hundreds of peasant insurrections throughout Russia. The discontent of the serfs was reflected in and fed by art and literature. Ivan Turgenov's Hunter Sketches talks about the serfs in Russia, when the serfs were quasi-slaves. In 1852, another novel was published, not in Russia, but in the United States. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is also a polemic against slavery. Because the Russian armies were largely composed of serfs, Tsar Alexander II makes the decision that he would emancipate the serfs in 1861, and this would help him with his military reforms to make the army more invested in Russia. The Russians make some necessary military reforms. There is also the growth of nihilists in Russia. A nihilist is, whatever happens is going to happen. There's nothing that I can do about it. Fate has been determined. And this really starts Russia down the road toward its revolution. There is also a resurgence of the Russian language and culture that is put on the rest of the Russian Empire. Because remember, it's not just Russia. You have Ukraine, Belarus, you have the various stands in Central Europe, you have Armenia, you have Azerbaijan, and you also have a Russian satellite state called Georgia. And all of these places had the Russian language forced upon them, Russian culture, the Orthodox religion, and so forth. And I focus on Georgia because one of the leaders of Russia in the 20th century, Joseph Stalin, is going to come from Georgia, and he will speak Russian as his first language. This is called Russification. With the end of the Crimean War, Austria was a declining power among the German states, while Prussia was on the rise. Now, one of the key factors in the ascension of Prussia was its chancellor, Prince Otto von Bismarck, whom you see photographed here in the traditional Prussian Pickelhaube, which is its spiked helmet. Known as the Iron Chancellor for his diplomacy of realpolitik and his powerful, strong rule at home, Otto von Bismarck was a wealthy Prussian Junker. A Junker is a noble, part of the aristocracy. He was a political conservative. He believed in monarchies. He believed in strength, the status quo. He expanded the Prussian military, and he believed that Germany should unite under the military leadership of Prussia. The Germans had voted in what was called the Frankfurt Referendum to all join together in a federal union. Bismarck poo-pooed that. He said, that's not the way you unite. On September the 30th, 1862, Bismarck made his famous speech. He said, Prussia must concentrate and maintain its power for the favorable moment which has already slipped by several times. Prussia's boundaries, according to the Vienna treaties, are not favorable to a healthy state life. The great questions of the time will not be resolved by speeches and majority decisions. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. Almost immediately, Bismarck kind of regretted that he used those terms, but it caused a sensation throughout Europe. The Germans were like, yeah. The French were like, oh shit. And it was through blood and iron that Bismarck would unite Germany. He now engages in a series of wars. First, he goes against Denmark in 1864 and pries away from the Danes their southernmost territory, which is called the Duchy of Schleswig-Holstein, which is where they have those nice, beautiful black and white cows. Then he goes to war against Austria in 1866. And rather than taking territory from the Austrians, he simply defeats the Austrians and then says, we are the preeminent German power. That's it. But it is against France that Bismarck will make the German Empire a reality. The Franco-Prussian War was basically a showdown over who got to be the preeminent power on the European continent. Now, everybody realized that Britain was the #1 power, but Britain was a sea power. It was not a land power. So France and Prussia are kind of facing off. And France had lost power when Prussia defeated Austria. Now, Napoleon III, who is getting older and he's not well, is now beginning to think about his dynasty. And he wants to secure his dynasty. And many, many rulers tried to validate their rule through war. He wanted a big win against Prussia. Meanwhile, the Prussians wanted the southern German states, especially the state of Bavaria, to join their new German federation. Now, the supposed casus belli of this war was the possibility that a prince from the Hohenzollern family, which is the same family that the kings of Prussia are from, might take the throne of Spain, meaning that France would be flanked by 2 German rulers. Now, even though the prince's candidacy for the throne of Spain was dropped, Bismarck leaked a false document making it look like the German king mistreated the French ambassador. And this made the French declare war, which was a very foolish thing because the French were outnumbered by the Germans and, more importantly, they were not as organized as the Prussians were. There were 3 major battles in this war. The first one was the Battle of Sedan, which is on the Meuse River. Sedan is the gateway into France. When the Prussians cross the river, the French find themselves surrounded, lose 17,000 men, and the emperor himself has to surrender to Bismarck. The second great battle is the Siege of Metz, in which 100,000 French soldiers are captured. Now the Prussians invade France and lay siege to Paris, and Paris eventually falls. As Paris is on the verge of falling, Bismarck takes all the German princes and rulers, and then he takes the King of Prussia and he brings them all to Versailles. And there in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire is declared. Meanwhile, the French depose Napoleon. Napoleon III will then go to Britain, where he will die just a few years later. And the Bonaparte house is no longer in charge. This is the beginning of the French Third Republic, which we'll get into in a little bit. There was also a brief Paris Commune, a socialist communist government in Paris during the siege that was violently put down by the French after the war. France had been defeated. France was humiliated. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The people of Paris shut themselves inside and didn't want to have anything to do with it, but they couldn't do anything about it. The Germans put a 5 million franc indemnity on the French that they have to pay off. They also take the region of Alsace-Lorraine away from the French. Now, this is a map of the German Federation and then the German Empire. In the dark red, that's called the North German Federation. The gold areas in the south, that's the largest areas, Bavaria and the Palatinate and other minor German states that are there, Swabia as well, which Bismarck wanted to have join the North German Confederation, and the war would do it. In the light beige area, that's Alsace-Lorraine, which has been captured from the French. Here you see Emperor Napoleon III sitting with Bismarck. The two men actually got along very well, even though Napoleon was his prisoner. Bismarck had wanted to use Napoleon in case of a chance to negotiate, but when the French deposed him, he was of no more use to Bismarck. The French were not about to allow Napoleon to come back and be a puppet of the Prussians. And so Napoleon III and his family eventually went to Great Britain, and there Napoleon died just a few years later. Bismarck was now the undisputed master of the new German Empire. But like all politicians who have won a great deal and have amassed a great deal of power, Bismarck engages in an overreach. His overreach is called Kulturkampf, Kampf, the K-A-M-P-F. It means struggle, like as in Mein Kampf, my struggle. This is a cultural struggle for Germany. It was a conflict between Bismarck and the Roman Catholic Church, basically opposing the power of the Catholic Church in Germany. Who was going to control education? Who was going to control ecclesiastical appointments? This is in large part a response to the Catholic Polish minority that lives in the Prussian kingdom. Remember that Prussia had annexed much of Poland. Bismarck engages in this because the French were no longer able to protect the Pope. They had drawn a lot of their soldiers out of Italy, and the French, who had long been the protectors of the Pope, now can no longer do that. And so Germany begins to decrease the influence of the Catholic Church. The problem was very simple, though, for Bismarck, and that is this. Germany has a lot of Catholics in it. And at the end of the day, Catholicism won out even over German nationalism. And so Kulturkampf was largely unsuccessful. Here you see a picture painted of the declaration of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. The German Empire is not declared in Berlin or Munich or Hamburg or Cologne or Dresden. It's declared at Versailles in France. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Number one, the German armies were in France at this particular time. Number two, Versailles is just a magnificent place. And number three, this is a big middle finger to the French. Now you notice that up on the dais is King Wilhelm I, Willie as he was called. He is now being made the Emperor of Germany. This is the creation of Wilhelm I as Kaiser of Germany, the Caesar of Germany. Now, while he's on the top of the dais, the man who dominates this picture is obviously Bismarck, who you see here in his white uniform. This is his triumph. Yes, Wilhelm becomes the Kaiser, but Bismarck is the man running the show. So here is the map of Europe with the various places to focus in on: London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Rome, Alsace-Lorraine, St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Crimea, and of course, my favorite city of them all, Constantinople. Please make sure you know this for the coming test.